Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Civilization Beyond Earth, or at least a first impressions of it after the Steam free weekend that just happened. As I'm recording this, it's the final day of the free weekend, and it actually ended a couple of hours ago. So, there may be another one in the future, I'm not entirely sure, but I didn't pick up the full game after this free weekend, and I'm going to be waiting for a pretty significant discount. And I'll get to that more in a moment. But suffice to say, this was developed by Firaxis and published by 2K in October of last year, and it was released to a pretty decent reception. People generally liked it, but there was some disappointment here and there, and I'll get more into that when I get to the main part of this thing, which is the gameplay. But as far as first impressions went, it looked fine. It's running in the DirectX 11 version of the Civilization 5 engine, so it's been improved. It runs better. The graphics are slightly better, but you don't really notice it all that much. It looks basically like Civilization 5, only with a sci-fi setting. One thing they did change considerably in terms of visuals was the interface, and I don't know why they went with the changes they did on that, but it looks awful. They tried to make it a more sci-fi, modern kind of interface, but at the same time, they just move things around to where they don't really make a whole lot of sense. Certain buttons just don't look necessarily like buttons, and it took me quite a while to actually get used to the production cues and things like that. See, in Civilization 5, it was all very intuitive, all laid out very well. In this, not so much. The interface itself ends up being confusing, and it takes you quite a bit of getting used to, and I never really got used to it in this time. So that is a problem, and that was really the only major issue I had with the visuals. The sound design was also pretty solid overall. The only real blemish on it was the voice acting, which was oddly amateurish and cheesy, and I didn't really care for it. The music was sci-fi centered, and there was more action to it than in previous Civ games, at least as far as you're used to, because you're used to that sort of orchestral or classical style of music that's kind of soothing, actually. Whereas in this, not so much. And I don't know whether it was just sound effects or actual music, but there was certain parts of the game where I would experience these electronic beeping noises in various patterns, and it kind of vaguely resembled music because there wasn't any music playing, at least as far as I could tell, but it kept playing these all over the place, and I wasn't entirely sure whether it was just sound effects or whether it was attempting to be music. Just not sure what happened there. But regardless, the presentation is mostly fine. It does have a few blemishes here and there, but most of it works perfectly fine. What really matters here, though, is the gameplay. There's really not a story to this thing. It is a 4X game. It's set in a sci-fi world, and the obvious comparisons are with Civilization 5 and Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri. Now, if you don't know Alpha Centauri, that was a 4X game from the 90s, and it is still widely considered one of the best strategy games ever made. That said, this thing clearly was trying to channel that vibe. Did it succeed? Yes and no. See, most of the mechanics from Civilization 5 return here. It's still hex-based tiles, you still have ranged attacks, you still have all the various systems that you had in terms of, say, wealth, food, culture, that sort of thing, all in Civilization 5. They did change up some of the particulars. For example, they changed up resource names. You have titanium, you have copper, you have Firaxite, and stuff like that. More sci-fi sounding resources available to you, but the premise is still the same. You build a tile improvement on them, and then you get access to those for building units, or for building structures, or just using for various purposes. You still have the social policies system from Civilization 5, the difference being that they changed it to a virtues track. Now, there's basically a tree of virtues that you pick from, and those are basically your social policies. But as you go through a given tier, you'll actually earn points toward special bonuses. For example, if you get, say, 5 in the first tier, and that's just by getting 5 random virtues within that tier, then you get access to a free virtue and things like that. There's also static bonuses or free technologies. Some of them will give you other bonuses as well. But suffice to say, they did that to change things up a bit, and it doesn't have the same names of the social policies. Instead, it's just basically things like, here is your track for industry, here is your track for growth, here is your track for this and that and the other thing. So that's a fairly insignificant change they made. It functions pretty much exactly the same. You generate culture in order to get virtues. That's pretty much it. And then there's other things that they changed up, like the unit trees. They are considerably more limited this time around, where you don't have a wide variety of units available to you. You don't have just gradual growth over time, where, for example, you can start in the Ancient Age and you can see yourself going from Stone Age warriors with clubs all the way up to modern infantrymen with assault rifles and things like that. Instead, you basically just have your basic sci-fi space marine kind of thing going on, and they gradually get upgraded over time. Now, you get different kinds of affinities in this thing. You have harmony, purity, and supremacy. And as you gain points in these various affinities, you will gain access to other bonuses. It starts off with a static bonus, eventually you start getting more units and things like that. And so, for example, if you go with the supremacy track, your normal soldiers and such will eventually upgrade into cyborgs or robots. It's kind of hard to tell, actually. But it's just an automatic upgrade system where you don't have to go in and manually upgrade like you did in the previous games. But in this one, you select the upgrade, it applies it to all of your units for free, and then you're good to go. And that's based entirely on the affinity system, once you get past a certain point anyway. And so that changes things up a slight bit, but there's really not the same kind of thing you would see in, say, Alpha Centauri, where units were pretty much fully customizable. You could give them entire loadouts where they would have certain weapons, they would have certain abilities based on what you gave them in terms of gear. And so that gave a lot of flexibility to Alpha Centauri, where this one just doesn't have that. In fact, it's very, very limited as the amount of units that you get and what their uses are. It's like they stripped down the units in Civilization 5 to their barest essentials, and that was it. And to replace barbarians, they have aliens. That's kinda it. Just a bunch of bug-like aliens. So, they do have that in there, and they did add in some particularly powerful aliens like the Kraken, which is just this massive thing that moves one tile at a time in the sea, or the sea dragons, which are just incredibly annoying, and things like that. But they basically function as barbarians and not much else. So whenever you clear an alien nest, you get energy or something like that. They added in the ability for explorers to conduct excavations on various sites that are scattered throughout the world, and those will give you one-time bonuses, usually something like points toward researching a certain topic, or points of energy, which is what replaces gold in this game, or points of culture, things like that. Just a random bonus. They also have resource pods, which allow you to get static bonuses as well, and it's just something you pick up. It's basically the equivalent of ruins from the previous games. Now, where they changed things up considerably is the tech web. Instead of a tech tree like you had in the previous games, you now have a tech web where it just kind of starts in the middle and branches out. I hate it. It's just hard to follow. I couldn't figure out what I really wanted to do with it. It didn't really explain the victory conditions all that well, and so I was just kind of left to my own devices. Eventually I figured something out, but I didn't really have any sort of drive like I do in the previous games. See, in the previous Civilization games, which actually have a historical context to them, you have that context to help you go forward. You know, for example, if you're a military-style civilization, you want to go for the techs that give you military production. You want to go for getting the best units as quickly as possible. There's ways to go, well, I want to go this route if I want to go this victory, and I know exactly what to do to get there because I have this historical context to help guide me there. With sci-fi, you don't have that. So you just have all of these nebulous concepts that don't necessarily have much to do with the things that they actually give you. And so I'm just sitting there having to stare at the tech web every single time I want to go to a new research project. And so that gets kind of annoying, actually. I'd sit there and go, well, do I want to go with this? Okay, maybe I want to go with this instead. I don't know what would be better for me. Because another thing that really drives me crazy about this game is that the factions don't really have any identity to them. Oh sure, the leaders themselves will speak a different language and they look different, but that's it. As far as I can tell, any sort of nuance that these various factions have was replaced by the affinity system. You'll notice in this video, at least possibly, that the AI just seems to go for harmony and not much else, or at least the factions that I kept running into are all like, well, let's go harmony. So my first playthrough, I went supremacy because I didn't know what to do with anything, and so they just suddenly started hating me. I was like, okay, what does this mean? And the more I went through it, the more I realized that the distinctions are fairly arbitrary. Whether you're going for purity, supremacy, or harmony, it's pretty arbitrary. Most of the time, the AI is going to choose one over all the others, and then if you don't choose that, they're going to hate you for it, and they'll just start going after you all the time, and you have to deal with that. And it seems like they tried to make certain affinities better for certain types of victory, where harmony seems to coincide most with the transcendence victory, and purity seems to go more for the militaristic side of things, and things like that. But that said, it still feels arbitrary, like they just threw the system in there because they knew that they didn't have any sort of actual personality to these various factions, and they're just like, well, screw it, make your own personality. Which I guess is fine, but when you don't have the context of things like, say, in Civilization 5 and before, where if you were going up against India, you know how Gandhi's going to behave, because he's frickin' Gandhi. You don't know how the leader of the Pan-Asian Cooperative is going to behave. You don't know how the leader of the Slavic faction that I can't remember the name of off the top of my head, you don't know how they behave. They're just these nebulous leaders that don't have any personalities to them. And so the context of the Civilization games before, where it's actually going through the ages of history, does a ton for those games, and you don't even realize it. Whereas you get to something like this, where all the mechanics are fairly straightforward if you've played a Civilization game before, and you still feel lost. I'm a veteran of the Civilization series, and I went into this thing, it took me a good hour to actually figure out what I was doing. And by then, I realized that, well, the game is really easy, because the AI isn't really aggressive enough until the late game. So I just picked an arbitrary victory condition and went, well, I guess we'll go with this. And that was the signal decoding victory. I don't even really remember what I did with that. I just know I won. It just felt like an arbitrary victory that was pretty much just handed to me. And so the worst possible thing for a strategy game to do actually happened in this thing. It's boring. I didn't feel like I was actually thinking throughout this entire time. I was just pressing buttons and seeing what happened. Whereas if I'm playing the other Civilization games, I know that I have to focus on various strategic elements, because that's what's going to lead me to victory. And I know that fairly early on I have to go into a certain victory track and go, okay, this is what I need to do in order to get this victory. In Beyond Earth, I just started pressing buttons and saw what happened. And I felt like I could have gotten any of the victories at any point, just if I decided, well, let's go this route, all of a sudden in the middle of the game, or even at the end of the game. I felt like I could have just picked a random victory condition and went for it and gotten it. And so, my first impressions of this thing are not good at all. It was boring. I breezed through the thing even though I basically had no idea what I was doing. And you'd think, after having played the previous Civilization games so much, I would know what I'm doing almost immediately upon entering this thing. And I didn't. I just started pressing buttons. It led me to victory somehow. I still don't comprehend it. And I was left going, is that it? Wow, that was kind of sad, actually. So, what it ends up feeling like is just a mod for Civilization 5, with less overall content and just a crisis of identity. It feels like without that historical context, these mechanics just don't really make a whole lot of sense. And if they had given it some sort of context, that would have made things better. You see, if you've played Alpha Centauri, you know that each of the factions has a very, very specific identity. And you know going into it that one faction is going to play a very specific way over the others. Whereas in this, it's just arbitrary. It just feels like this jumbled mess of mechanics that ultimately left me cold. Will it get better? Hopefully. I really do hope that the full game just expands upon things more, and when I get actually time to go into this thing further than just a first impressions kind of thing. But my first impressions are so bad that I really can't justify getting this thing until it goes on a very steep discount. And by steep discount, I'm talking less than $10. Hopefully with expansions included, because it seems like the content in this thing is incredibly bare bones. I mean, we're talking all these systems that were in Civilization 5 are just gone. Stuff that was added into the game and stuff like, say, Brave New World. None of that stuff is in there. The cultural victory kind of stuff, none of that's in here. What they did change up was they added in quests that are basically just an arbitrary decision, and you pick, well, do I want production or do I want gold, basically. Okay, whatever. So they did at least have something there to change things up a bit, but by and large it just feels like Civilization 5 all over again, but with no identity to it. And in a game that's sci-fi, having its own identity is really a big thing. Again, I hope it gets better when I actually get to the full game later on, even if it's, you know, a year or two down the line. But still, I am thoroughly unimpressed with this thing thus far. And I'm just curious to know what you guys think of it, because I admittedly didn't get much time to play this thing over the weekend. I put in about 3.5, maybe 4 hours during my first playthrough of this thing, and that's kind of it, really. So obviously I'm not really getting the really fine points here, but I still want to talk about it because I'm just so thoroughly unimpressed and disappointed with this thing that I've just been left utterly confused by it. So let me know what you guys think of this thing in the comments. Maybe those of you who played it for longer can expand on some things that I touched on, because again, I didn't play this thing for all that long. I didn't have much time to do so. I will certainly go back to it eventually and do a full-on review, and hopefully if they put out some expansions, they'll solve that whole lack of content problem. But overall, right now, going off of just my first impressions, I can't really recommend it, which is kind of sad, actually. Thanks for watching.